Intuitively, it seems reasonable to be concerned that jurors may be influenced by media coverage of the cases they are serving on. It is quite common for the media to be prohibited from publishing certain details about a case, including a defendant's prior criminal history for this reason. Concern about the possible influence of media exposure on jurors' decisions is one of the reasons that here in Queensland, judge-only trials are allowed in high-profile cases that have received significant adverse media coverage. So should we really be worried about jurors' exposure to media stories? Let's look at what the research says. We know from Mullen and Linds's 1995 research that media reports about the accused or defendant tend to be negative. In their study, Mullen and Linz used content analysis of actual media reports in 14 large newspapers in the United States of America over an 8-week period. In those reports, 27% of suspects were described in a negative way that might undermine the fairness of the trial. The comments included derogatory assertions about the defendant's character and statements about the defendant's guilt. So does this type of negative media exposure actually influence jurors? Well, research by a number of authors, such as Fine and colleagues in 1997, Hope and colleagues in 2004, and River and McAvoy in 2008, is reasonably clear on this point. Media exposure that describes the defendant in a negative light can cause jurors to view the defendant more harshly and result in more guilty verdicts compared to jurors not exposed to such media coverage. In fact, Steble and colleagues' 1999 meta-analysis of 23 studies covering a total of 5,755 participants found that participants exposed to negative pre-trial publicity were more likely to find the defendant guilty than those who were not exposed to such media stories. This was a small to moderate effect. There is some evidence from that meta-analysis, however, that the effect size does vary. We generally see a stronger effect of media exposure on jurors' decisions when studies use community members as participants. The effect is also stronger in cases involving murder, sex abuse and drugs. And we know also that exposure to actual media stories rather than stories created for the purpose of the experiment also makes the effect stronger, as does longer intervals between exposure and having to decide a verdict. It's reassuring, however, that when the evidence against the defendant is weak, the effect is actually reduced. This was demonstrated in research by Kerr and colleagues in 1999. So that's what the experimental research suggests. What about actual cases? Well, Devine and colleagues' 2009 study looked at the effect of media exposure in 179 criminal trials in Indiana in the United States of America. They found an increased likelihood of conviction in trials for which judges reported being aware of pre-trial publicity. One of the reasons that media exposure might have had these effects is due to confusion over where information about the trial is coming from. Research by Roberts in 1987 suggests that jurors sitting on highly publicised trials may attribute information that they have learned from the media to evidence actually presented in court. So this effect is related to the sleeper effect, which was described by Hovland and Weiss. This is where something has a delayed impact on us because we forget that it comes from a source that should perhaps not be relied upon. A study by Hope and colleagues in 2004 suggested that pre-trial publicity can also result in jurors thinking more negatively about the evidence that supports the defendant's side of the case. So jurors discount the evidence in favour of the defendant when thinking about the defendant's guilt. The publicity effectively distorts jurors' memories of the evidence in favour of the prosecution case. As you'll hear in the next episode, such media coverage can help shape the story that jurors create to explain the evidence they hear about the trial. However, before we turn to that, a final question we should consider is whether we should be worried about this. Is this a big problem? Well, in reality, only a small percentage of cases actually receive pre-trial publicity. The concern is that in those that do get reported in the media, they receive a considerable amount of exposure. Consistent with this, there was also a study by Brusk and Logues in 1999 that looked for pre-trial newspaper reports in 134 different first-degree murder cases. They found that 46% of those cases received no coverage in the news media. Of those that did have stories written about them, about a fifth had between 1 and 5 reports. Another fifth had between 6 and 10 reports, and 16% had 11 or more stories written about them. So what can be done about this? It's not really possible to stop every potential juror from being exposed to media about a particular case. Often the media will cover a story many months or years before a jury trial. And so you have no way of knowing who the potential jurors will be. Also, it's not really possible for a court to impose a restriction on media reporting about a case until there is a defendant who's been identified. One of the remedies for media exposure, apart from a judge-only trial, is to give jurors directions to disregard any media stories about the case they may have seen or heard. Now, this is a pretty easy remedy to use, but unfortunately it's not very effective at reducing this bias, as research by Devine and colleagues in 2001 suggested. Now, it's very hard for people to unsee and unhear things that they've been exposed to in the media, and these things continue to influence them. One thing that Devine suggested in 2012 as seeming to work is changing the venue of the trial, which has the effect of changing the potential jurors for a group of people who are less likely to have heard about the case. Of course, in addition to the influence of the media on jurors, we've already discussed how the memory of eyewitnesses who might give evidence in the trial could be influenced by misleading or biased information. If a media report contains inaccuracies, then it's possible that these inaccuracies could affect what an eyewitness remembers about a crime, potentially leading to false memories. Even if the media report contains no factual inaccuracies, it's possible that the contents of the media report could affect eyewitness memory, as in the example where the use of a word smash to describe a car crash led people to think there was glass at the scene when there was not.